sited opposite what is now the Spar shop and was constructed of timber and corrugated iron. It was first named, as you probably all know, the East Meon Reading Room, Library and Coffee House, and later known as the Village Institute, or just as the Institute. Space for car parking was non-existent, for cars hadn't been invented in 1881. And so-called toilet facilities were outside and primitive. Yet the Institute was well loved. When I joined the management committee, the then vicar, Roger Smith, was chairman. John and Pam Sparrow, who lived in the adjacent caretaker's cottage, were the caretakers, and committee meetings were held in their cottage. Then in 1968, the late Herbie Goddard, who was already parish council chairman, succeeded the vicar as chairman of the Village Hall Committee. Herbie was a wonderful man, Mr. East Meon, and behind his back was often referred to as the mayor. I believe his election as chairman was the best thing that ever happened to the old hall. However, in 1968, I was horrified at the great cost of maintaining the old building. The corrugated iron was rusty, the timber was constantly needing repairs from dry rot, death watch beetle and other diseases. As fast as funds were raised for improvements, money disappeared into a bottomless pit for repairs. Then in the early 1970s, I had an unusual stroke of luck in the shape of a very bad attack of influenza, which meant I couldn't attend a committee meeting which was nearly due, but by the day of the meeting, though I was unfit to venture out, my brain seemed fairly clear, and I wrote a letter to Herbie hoping that it would be read at the meeting. And what I said, I'd come to the conclusion there was no sensible option other than scrapping the old hall and building a new one to be largely financed by demolition of the hall and the caretaker's cottage and sale of the site for housing development. So with a shaky hand, I wrote to Herbie on those lines, suggesting he should read it to the meeting. He did, and surprise, surprise, reaction was favourable. Thereafter, every possible new hall site was considered, including the site where we are tonight. Outline planning consent was obtained and a purchase price negotiated with the local landowners. But we faced major problems. First, Workhouse Lane residents were understandably apprehensive of noise and disturbance late at night, and secondly, rampaging inflation was going ahead at the rate of 20% per annum. Public meetings were held in the hope of reassuring Workhouse Lane and other nearby residents by designing the intended new hall without windows on its east and southern sides, and by setting it well back from Workhouse Lane. As for the size and design of the new hall, we obtained details of other new halls which had recently been built in Hampshire, and members of the committee toured about the countryside inspecting these halls. One at Bramley, near Basingstoke, seemed to be just about what we were looking for, and so an architect was commissioned to design the hall here, very largely based on that at Bramley. Then, as we were near to inviting tenders from builders, there came an unfortunate diversion in the shape of an alternative proposal for the hall to be sited in the recreation ground. That was an unsound idea for a number of reasons, but it found much support, and through causing 6 months delay, increased the estimated building cost by something like £2,000. And if that were not bad enough, the cost of the land here was also increased. We've forgotten what hyperinflation was like. At 20% per annum, the cost of a new building would increase from, say, 40,000 to 48,000 in 1 year. So while the village was feverishly engaged in every form of fundraising, we were not merely running to remain stationary, but even going into reverse. Though we had an idea of the sum likely to result from sale of the old hall site, and had been promised grants by various bodies, including our parish council, we felt we dared not sign a building contract until we were certain the cost would be available. The situation was desperate, so I suggested to Herbie that I should approach Sir Linton White, then Mr. Linton White, always a generous village benefactor, to see if he would be prepared to guarantee a personal loan of £20,000, free of interest, if and when needed, without any security, but merely upon my personal assurance that it would be repaid within 2 years. He asked no questions and immediately agreed. At that time, £20,000 was the equivalent of at least £50,000 today, perhaps more, and his reaction was typical of his great generosity and trust. The vital part he played was probably unknown to most people at the time, and it may be largely unknown today. We were able to sign a contract at once. The sale of the old hall and cottage was put in hand. Messrs. Moulds were awarded the building contract, and work commenced in a sea of mud. Fittingly, Sir Linton laid the foundation stone. The village was inevitably without a hall for quite a while. It may have been for at least a year, and our committee meetings were held in the comfort of Herbie's house. I've almost completed this reminiscence, but must refer to two important matters. First, all members of the whole committee pulled together in whipping up support. It would be invidious to name any one as being particularly praiseworthy, though I know Mrs. Lettice Ross, the secretary, worked herself to the point of exhaustion. Others included 3 stalwart ladies who are still around and here this evening, who seem ageless: Ivy Cook, Iris Porter, and Kath Barrow. And these names are not by any means exhaustive. And that wonderful lady, Mrs. Dorcas Simpson, was the queen of all fundraisers. My final revelation is that shortly after Linton White had made it possible to start the building, it was decided, with Herbie's approval, to try to spread the risk of the vital £20,000 guarantee by replacing it with a total of 10 separate £2,000 guarantees by 10 individuals. So I approached local people with that in mind, and everyone immediately said yes. I was not surprised, but looking back, it was rather remarkable. The end of that part of the story was that no guarantor lost any money. Finally, I've not intended to exaggerate the importance of my part in events that are now local history. Herbie Goddard was the dynamic leader, coordinator, and inspiration, and at the time I told him the new hall would be his memorial. It was, and it is. Thank you.